The summer of 2013 did not arrive with a bang, but with a gentle, deceptive warmth that settled over Columbus, Ohio, like a promise kept. It was a season of thresholds, that fleeting, fragile window where the weight of the past has been shed, and the gravity of the future hasn't yet taken hold. For Rachel Vaughn, Donnie Herrera, Ethan Moss, and Jordan Bell, it was supposed to be the final chapter of their youth. A 100-hour exhale before the world claimed them. They were recent graduates of Ohio State University, 22 years old and brimming with that specific, nervous energy that only comes when you are standing on the edge of everything. In a few weeks, their lives would be defined by resumes, lease agreements, and the gray geometry of office cubicles. But for now, they had a silver Toyota Highlander, a shared bank account for gas, and a horizon that felt like it belonged exclusively to them. Rachel was the architect of the trip. Organized to a fault, she was the one who had mapped the general trajectory southeast into the Appalachian heartland, down toward the Blue Ridge Parkway. She wasn't looking for a rigorous itinerary, she was looking for a feeling. She wanted the smell of damp pine, the sound of hidden waterfalls, and the kind of silence you can't find in a college town. Beside her, Ethan Moss occupied a space that was increasingly complicated. They had been the golden couple of their friend group for 3 years, but the friction of graduation had started to wear them thin. They were still together, but there was a quiet, unspoken understanding that this trip was a salvage mission, a last-ditch effort to see if their love could survive the transition into adulthood. In the back seat sat Donnie Herrera, the group's heartbeat. She was the one who kept the playlist moving and the tension low, her laughter a constant, reliable tether to the present. And then there was Jordan Bell. Quiet, mechanical, and observant. Jordan was the kind of person who listened to the engine of the car as much as the conversation. He had just landed a prestigious internship in Colorado, a feat that should have made him the most relaxed of the four. Yet, those who knew him best noticed a shadow behind his eyes, a pensive stillness that suggested he was carrying a weight he wasn't yet ready to share. They left Columbus on a Thursday morning, the sun still low and pale against the brickwork of the city. The Highlander was packed with the chaotic essentials of a road trip: sleeping bags, overstuffed backpacks, energy drinks, and a physical roadmap that Rachel insisted on keeping, despite the GPS on their phones. There is something about a map that feels more real, more adventurous. It's a document of intent. By 2:47 p.m. they reached a small rest stop near the border, where Virginia begins to ripple into the foothills of the North Carolina mountains. The heat was thick now, shimmering off the asphalt. It was here that Rachel took the photo that would eventually haunt the nation. In the image, the four of them are lined up against the Highlander, the back hatch open to reveal a jumble of gear. Rachel is leaning against the driver's side door, her smile genuine, her eyes squinting against the sun. Donnie, wearing an oversized bucket hat, is flashing a peace sign, her face a mask of carefree joy. Ethan has his arm draped around Jordan, whose smile looks tired, perhaps a bit forced, but still present. Rachel posted it to Instagram with a simple caption, "Refueling before the wild begins." It was a timestamp in digital memory, a high watermark of their lives. At that moment, they were just 4 kids on a lark, unaware that they were stepping off the map and into a void. As they pulled away from the rest stop, the landscape began to change. The flat, predictable horizons of the Midwest gave way to the ancient, rolling majesty of the Blue Ridge. The roads grew narrower, twisting into switchbacks that hugged the sides of steep ravines. The green of the forest became deeper, more suffocating, a canopy of oak and hickory that seemed to swallow the light. They reached the town of Meadows of Dan just as the shadows were beginning to stretch. A final transaction was logged at a local gas station, 37.12 cents for fuel, and a few bags of trail mix. The attendant, a man who had lived in those mountains his entire life, would later tell investigators that he remembered the silver SUV. He remembered the music, something loud and rhythmic, and the way the kids seemed to be arguing over a map. Not a heated argument, just the typical back and forth of people who had spent too many hours in a confined space. They asked about a trail spur, the attendant recalled, his voice rasping with the weight of hindsight. Something off the main parkway. I told Em the fog was coming in early, that they ought to stick to the paved routes. But you know how kids are. They think the world is built for them. By 5:00 p.m., the Highlander turned onto the Blue Ridge Parkway, a ribbon of asphalt that winds through some of the most beautiful and treacherous terrain in the eastern United States. The mountains here don't just sit, they loom. They are old, weathered by ions, and they have a way of absorbing sound and light. As they drove higher, the predicted fog began to materialize. It didn't roll in so much as it emerged from the earth itself, thin, ghostly tendrils at first, then a thick, white shroud that erased the taillights of the cars ahead of them. Visibility dropped to less than 20 feet. The world became a claustrophobic tunnel of gray. Inside the car, the mood shifted. The music was turned down. Rachel gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white, her eyes straining to find the yellow line of the road. Ethan leaned forward, his hand on the dashboard, trying to peer through the gloom. "Maybe we should pull over," Donnie suggested from the back, her voice losing its usual melodic lilt. "There's nowhere to pull over," Rachel replied, her voice tight. "The shoulder is gone. It's just a drop-off." They were looking for a specific access road, a gravel fire trail that Jordan had found mentioned in an old hiking forum. It was supposed to lead to an overlook that offered a view of the Dan River Basin. A place where they could camp in solitude, away from the crowded state parks. In the fog, every gap in the treeline looked like a possibility. Every turn felt like a gamble. They didn't know it then, but they had already crossed a threshold. The cell towers in this region were sparse, and the dense mineral content of the mountains, combined with the heavy moisture in the air, created dead zones where signals simply died. At 3:12 p.m., Rachel's phone made its final handshake with a tower near Rocky Knob. It wasn't a call or a text, it was just the device's silent, desperate attempt to find a connection. Then, there was only the silence. Back in Columbus, the weekend passed with a deceptive normalcy. Parents expected a few days of radio silence. That was the nature of camping, after all. But by Monday morning, when Rachel didn't show up for her shift at the local bakery, and Donnie's phone went straight to voicemail for the 50th time, the silence began to take on a different texture. It wasn't the silence of a vacation, it was the silence of an absence. Lorraine Vaughn, Rachel's mother, was the first to call the police. She was told to wait. They were adults, the officer said. They were on a road trip. People get sidetracked. People lose their chargers. But Lorraine knew her daughter. Rachel didn't miss shifts. Rachel didn't leave her mother wondering. By Tuesday, the missing posters began to appear on social media. The Instagram photo from the rest stop was cropped and shared thousands of times. "Have you seen these four?" The faces of Rachel, Ethan, Donnie, and Jordan became the faces of a national mystery. The search effort that followed was one of the largest in Virginia's history. State police, park rangers, and FBI analysts descended on the Blue Ridge. They used infrared drones that could see through the canopy. They deployed cadaver dogs that could scent a single drop of blood in a square mile of forest. They interviewed every hiker, every gas station clerk, every local who might have caught a glimpse of a silver SUV. But the mountains are experts at keeping secrets. The terrain was a labyrinth of rotted wooden guardrails, overgrown logging roads, and steep ravines choked with rhododendron and laurel. A car could go off the road and be hidden from view within seconds, swallowed by the verticality of the landscape. Days turned into weeks. The searchers grew weary. The news cycle, always hungry for the next tragedy, began to move on. But for the families, time didn't move forward, it curled in on itself. They were trapped in that final Thursday, eternally waiting for a car that never returned, listening for a phone that would never ring. Lorraine Vaughn stayed in a motel near Meadows of Dan for 3 months. Every morning, she would drive a section of the parkway, looking for a break in the brush, a glint of metal in the sun, a sign that her daughter was still out there. She talked to the trees. She talked to the fog. She begged at the mountains to give them back. But the mountains remained indifferent. The Highlander had vanished as if it had never existed, leaving behind only a digital ghost of a smile and a caption that had become a cruel prophecy. They had gone into the wild, and the wild had closed its doors behind them. For 12 years, that was the end of the story. A cold case. A collection of what-ifs stored in a cardboard box in a basement in Richmond. A generation of Ohio State students grew up hearing the legend of the four who vanished. People speculated about cults, about serial killers, about a planned disappearance. They didn't realize that the answer wasn't hidden in a conspiracy. It was hidden in the earth itself, just a few yards from the road they had traveled, waiting for a moment when the soil would finally decide to speak. The silence that followed the disappearance of the Silver Highlander was not a sudden snap, but a slow, suffocating bleed. In the high reaches of the Blue Ridge, silence is not merely the absence of sound, it is a physical presence. It is the weight of the mist settling into the valleys and the rhythmic, indifferent pulse of a forest that has existed long before human maps and will endure long after them. By the second week of July 2013, the search operation had transformed the sleepy trailhead of Trail Hollow into a staging ground for a ghost hunt. The air was thick with the scent of diesel from idling command vehicles and the damp, metallic smell of the ever-present fog. Over 50 square miles of wilderness were being dissected with surgical intensity. Search and rescue SR teams moved in tight grids, their bright orange vests vivid against the oppressive deep greens of the Appalachian brush. But as the days stretched into a fortnight, a haunting realization began to settle over the investigators. They were looking for a 2-ton vehicle and 4 energetic adults objects that should leave a scar on the landscape. Yet, there was nothing. No broken branches at chest height, no tire ruts in the soft shoulder of the fire roads, no discarded snack wrappers or caught threads of denim. It was as if the mountain had opened its mouth, swallowed the Highlander whole, and smoothed the grass back down. The FBI's Digital Forensics Unit in Richmond worked in a different kind of silence, the hum of servers and the blue light of monitors. They were chasing ghost pings. Rachel's phone had reached out one last time at 3:12 p.m. on that fateful Thursday. It was a 5-second handshake with a tower perched on a distant ridge, a desperate digital cry for help that found no listener. Analysts mapped the radius of that tower, creating a probability cone that covered thousands of acres of vertical, jagged terrain. The problem, one lead investigator noted in a leaked memo, is that in these mountains, a signal doesn't travel in a circle. It bounces off granite. It dies in the hollows. That phone could have been 3 miles away, or it could have been at the bottom of a 500-foot ravine directly beneath the tower. As the physical trail went cold, the investigation turned inward, probing the lives the four had left behind. In the sterile light of interview rooms, the perfect friendship began to show its tectonic plates. Ethan Moss's father, a man who spoke in the clipped, weary tones of a retired deputy, sat across from detectives and rubbed his face. Ethan was restless, he admitted, his voice cracking. He loved Rachel, but he was terrified of the forever part. He'd moved his things out of their shared apartment 2 nights before they left. He told me he wanted this trip to be a clean break or a new beginning. He didn't know which. Then there was the enigma of Jordan Bell. Jordan, the mechanical engineer who saw the world in terms of stress points and structural integrity. His laptop, recovered from his bedroom in Columbus, revealed a series of unsent emails to an undisclosed recipient. One line stood out, etched into the digital record like a warning. I can't keep the secret anymore. If I don't tell them on the trip, the weight of it is going to break us all. The public, fueled by the vacuum of information, began to manufacture its own truths. On Reddit and TrueCrime forums, the Trail Hollow 4 became a dark obsession. Armchair detectives analyzed the final Instagram photo with a fervor that bordered on the religious. They pointed to the shadow in the background, claiming it was a fifth person. They dissected the reflection in Donnie's sunglasses, swearing they saw a man holding a rifle. One YouTube creator, with a penchant for the macabre, released a 3-hour documentary theorizing that the group hadn't crashed at all. He suggested they had stumbled upon a dark site, a survivalist compound, or a clandestine government facility, hidden in the folds of the national forest. The mountains don't eat cars, he told his million viewers. People eat people, and some people don't want to be found. But for the families, the noise of the internet was just a cruel distortion of the silence in their homes. Lorraine Vaughn had stopped eating. She spent her days sitting in Rachel's bedroom, the air there growing stale and heavy. She kept the windows closed because she couldn't bear the sound of the world continuing to turn outside. Every morning, she would call Rachel's phone, just to hear the voicemail. "Hey, it's Rachel! Leave a message after the beep, and I'll get back to you when I'm back on the grid." "Beep. Rachel," Lorraine would whisper. "The grid is waiting. Please, just tell me where you are." In late July, a fleeting lead breathed life into the dying embers of the search. A park ranger stationed near Lover's Leap reported a flare-like light deep in the Dan River Basin on the night of the disappearance. For 48 hours, teams were redirected, rappelling into sunless gorges and wading through waist-deep mountain streams. They found an old moonshine still from the 1940s and a discarded campsite from a group of hikers who had been through the area weeks prior. But of the Highlander, there was not a trace of silver, not a shard of glass. By the end of August, the official search was scaled back. The active status was replaced by inactive/cold. It was a bureaucratic death sentence. The helicopters stopped their rhythmic thumping over the ridgelines. The orange vests vanished from the trailheads. The forest returned to the deer and the bears, and the thick, green curtain of the Appalachian summer began to knit itself shut over the secrets of 2013. The years that followed were a slow erosion. Donnie's father, the stoic military man, finally turned off the porch light in 2018, not out of a loss of love, but out of a crushing, exhausted acceptance. Ethan's brother stopped speaking his name, as if the very syllables were a poison. Jordan's mother, however, became a ghost of the parkway herself. Every anniversary, she would park her car at the rest stop from the photo and hand out flyers to tourists who looked at her with a mix of pity and fear. She didn't want their sympathy, she wanted their eyes. She believed that if enough people looked into the green depths of the mountains, the forest would eventually blink. She was right, in a way. But it wouldn't be a hiker or a detective who found them. It would be the relentless march of progress. 12 years passed. 12 winters of ice expanding in the rock fissures, 12 springs of runoff carving new paths through the clay. The world moved from 3G to 5G. The social media platforms where they posted their last photo became relics of a different era. The 4 graduates were no longer missing kids, they were a legend, a cautionary tale whispered by campfire light about the dangers of the gray fog. Until March 2025. A minor road expansion project on Route 58 west of the Dan River had been delayed for months by environmental permits. When the excavators finally arrived, they weren't looking for history. They were looking for a drainage slope. The operator, a local man who had been a teenager when the OSU-4 disappeared, felt his bucket strike something that didn't vibrate like rock and didn't give like wood. It was a dull, hollow thud, the sound of metal that had been under the earth for a long, long time. As he pulled the bucket back, a strip of silver-painted chrome emerged from the red Virginia clay, glinting in the afternoon sun like a coin tossed into a well. He stopped the engine. In the sudden, ringing silence of the construction site, the mountain finally began to give back what it had taken. But as the mud slid away from the crushed roof of the Toyota Highlander, the investigators realized that the where was only the beginning. The how and the who were about to become a far darker nightmare. The earth has a memory, though it often lacks the mercy to share it when we are most desperate. For 12 years, the Dan River Basin held its breath, preserving a secret that had long since passed into the realm of local folklore and digital ghost stories. The Silver Highlander wasn't lost in the clouds or spirited away by a conspiracy, it was merely resting, entombed in a cathedral of red clay and rot. Less than 50 yards from the road, the search teams had paced 1,000 times. It was March 2025 when the mountain finally decided to exhale. The road expansion project was supposed to be a mundane affair, a widening of a drainage slope, to prevent the very runoff that had helped bury the evidence a decade prior. When the excavator bucket caught that first jagged strip of chrome, the operator didn't immediately call the police. He thought of the stories. Everyone in Patrick County knew the legend of the 4 from Ohio. He climbed down from his cab into the damp, cool air of the hollow, his boots sinking into the soft earth, and saw a fragment of a taillight, still red, still defiant against the dull brown of the silt. By sunset, the hollow was no longer a construction site, it was a sanctuary. The recovery was a slow, agonizing ballet of forensic precision. Because the vehicle had been buried under successive layers of sediment and dense vegetation, it had become a time capsule. As the floodlights cut through the rising mountain mist, the state police recovery team peeled back the earth. The Highlander emerged like a shipwreck from the depths of the sea. The roof was a jagged inward V, crushed by the initial impact, with a massive hemlock tree before the car had rolled into its final resting place. As the mud was brushed away from the windows, the silence on the ridge grew heavy. Inside, the world of 2013 was still intact. In the driver's seat, slumped toward the center console, were the remains of Ethan Moss. His seatbelt was still buckled, a nylon strap that had outlasted the skin and muscle it was meant to protect. Beside him, in the passenger seat, lay Donnie Herrera. The forensic technicians noted with a grim quietude that her hand was resting on the center armrest, just inches from Ethan's, as if they had reached for each other in the final, terrifying seconds of the plunge. In the back seat, pinned by the collapsed roof, was Rachel Vaughn. She was found surrounded by the gear she had so meticulously packed: a blue backpack, a rusted canister of bear spray, and a digital camera that would later be found to have a shattered lens but an intact memory card. But as the count reached 3, the atmosphere shifted from grief to a chilling, renewed confusion. The Highlander was a confined space, its doors jammed shut by the sheer force of the Earth's pressure and the crumpled frame. Yet, the fourth seat, Jordan Bell's seat, was empty. The back hatches sealed, the lead investigator whispered, his voice caught by the portable microphones. The windows are too small for an adult to crawl through, and the front windshield is a spiderweb of safety glass, still mostly in its frame. If he wasn't ejected during the roll, where is he? The answer arrived 48 hours later, not from a detective, but from the lab. Among the personal effects recovered from the backseat floorboard was a water-damaged leather journal. Most of the pages were a pulpy, illegible mess, but the very last entry had been shielded by a plastic map laminate. The handwriting was frantic, the ink bleeding into the paper like a weeping wound, but the words were unmistakable. Donnie's breathing is wrong. Ethan won't wake up. Rachel is pinned, she can't feel her legs. I managed to kick the rear side window out before the mud rose. It's so dark, I'm going to climb up to the road. I'll mark the trees with the red tape. If you find this, I've gone north. Back soon. Stay quiet. The revelation sent a shockwave through the investigation. Jordan Bell hadn't died in the crash. He had survived the impact, survived the terrifying burial of the vehicle, and had somehow squeezed through a narrow gap in the broken glass to seek help for his dying friends. The families were brought to the site one by one, a procession of the broken-hearted. Lorraine Vaughn stood at the edge of the ravine, her hair now white, her eyes fixed on the silver wreck that had held her daughter for 12 years. She didn't scream. She didn't weep. She simply reached out a hand toward the hollow, as if she could still feel the warmth of Rachel's life radiating from the clay. He left them. Donnie's father muttered, his voice a cocktail of rage and sorrow as he read the transcript of the note. He got out, and he left them there to die in the dark. No, Ethan's brother countered, his voice sharp. He went for help. He was 22, hurt, and terrified. He did the only thing a person could do. But the tragedy was deeper than a choice. The red tape Jordan mentioned was found 3 days later. It wasn't on the road. It was deeper in the woods, heading in the exact opposite direction of Route 58. Disoriented by a massive concussion and the blinding mountain fog, Jordan Bell hadn't climbed toward the asphalt. He had climbed further into the heart of the Dan River Basin, moving deeper into the sunless wilderness with every step he took toward safety. The search for Jordan Bell, dormant for over a decade, was reignited with a feverish intensity. If he had survived the crash, how far could a wounded man go? The forensic team expanded the grid, moving north into a section of the forest known as the Devil's Slide, a place of loose shale and hidden sinkholes. It was here that the nature of the mystery changed from a car accident to a survival horror. They found his boots first. They were sitting side by side on a flat lichen-covered rock, nearly half a mile from the crash site. They weren't tossed aside in a struggle. They were placed neatly, as if he had intended to put them back on. The laces were untied, the leather stiffened by 12 years of rain and sun, but they were upright. Hypothermia, the medical examiner explained to the hushed group of reporters. In the final stages, the brain misfires. You feel like you're burning up. You start to strip. We call it paradoxical undressing. He would have felt a frantic need to get out of his clothes, even as the frost was stopping his heart. But the boots on the rock didn't explain the final discovery. Another 100 yards uphill, tucked into the hollowed-out root system of an ancient dying oak, they found what remained of Jordan. He hadn't died out in the open. He had crawled into the earth, seeking the very shelter that had just claimed his friends. DNA would eventually confirm the identity, but the families didn't need a lab. They saw the silver St. Christopher medal tangled in the roots, the one his mother had given him for graduation. The tragedy of the Virginia 2013 case wasn't just that they died. It was the almost. They were so close to the road that the sound of passing cars must have taunted them through the earth. Jordan had been so close to saving them, only to be betrayed by the very terrain he had come to admire. As the sun set on the final day of the recovery, the four friends were finally together again, laid out in the quiet hum of the morgue, finally removed from the mountain's grip. The mystery was solved, the map was complete. But as the investigators looked back at the neat rows of boots and the frantic notes in the journal, they realized that some silences are never truly broken. They are only shared. The resolution of the Virginia 2013 case did not bring the peace the families had spent over a decade praying for. Instead, it brought a clinical, devastating clarity. When the remains of the four friends were finally removed from the earth in 2025, the investigation shifted from a recovery mission to a forensic post-mortem of a tragedy that had been avoidable by a matter of yards. The extraction of the digital camera from Rachel Vaughn's backpack proved to be the most vital piece of the puzzle. Despite the internal corrosion, specialized technicians in Quantico were able to bypass the damaged hardware and pull 34 files from the memory card. The final photos were not of the scenery. They were evidence of a descent into panic. The last image, time-stamped at 4:52 p.m. on that Thursday in 2013, was a blurred, handheld shot taken through the windshield of the Highlander. It showed a wall of gray fog so thick it looked like solid stone. In the bottom corner of the frame, the yellow line of the parkway was visible, but it was slanted at a sharp, impossible angle. The investigators concluded that this was the exact moment the tires lost their grip on the rain-slicked shoulder. They didn't just drive off a cliff, the lead investigator explained at a closed-door briefing for the families. The car slid. It was a slow-motion disaster. They caught a patch of loose shale, and once the weight of the SUV shifted, the mountain just pulled them down. The car had tumbled nearly 300 feet, but it hadn't fallen straight. It had rolled through a thicket of rhododendron that acted like a net, slowing the descent until the vehicle slammed roof first into a massive hemlock. The impact had instantly killed Ethan and Donnie. Rachel, pinned in the back, had survived for hours, possibly days. But the most haunting discovery was found during the final sweep of the Devil's Slide, the area where Jordan Bell's remains were discovered. Near the hollowed-out tree where Jordan had spent his final moments, a searcher found a discarded piece of white plastic. It was a fragment of a taillight casing from the Highlander. On the inside of the plastic, Jordan had used a sharp stone to scratch a series of numbers, 37.12. It was the exact amount of their last gas station transaction. Psychologists theorized it was a grounding technique, a way for a dying, concussed man to hold on to his reality as the hypothermia and the silence of the woods began to dissolve his mind. He was trying to remember who he was and where he had been before the world turned gray. In the summer of 2025, a permanent memorial was erected at the site of the recovery. It isn't a grand statue, but a simple granite bench overlooking the Dan River Basin, placed exactly where the red tape Jordan had tied, was finally found. The families eventually drifted apart, the shared bond of a mystery replaced by the individual burdens of grief. Lorraine Vaughn returned to Columbus, but she never moved out of the house with Rachel's bedroom. She said she liked the silence now. It no longer felt like a question, but an answer. The Trail Hollow 4 became a case study for search and rescue teams across the country. It led to the Von Bell Protocol, a set of guidelines for searching vertical terrain that mandates thermal imaging even in areas deemed unreachable by foot. Because of them, 3 other missing hikers were found alive in the years following the recovery. As for the Blue Ridge Parkway, the fog still rolls in every July, thick and deceptive. Tourists still stop at the overlooks to take photos of the rolling green majesty. But for those who know the story, the mountains no longer look like a backdrop. They look like a vault. The story of Rachel, Ethan, Donnie, and Jordan ended not with a bang, but with a quiet return to the earth. They were 4 friends who went looking for the wild, and in the end, the wild simply decided to keep them. The map is finally complete. The names are etched in stone, and the Silver Highlander is gone, but on certain quiet evenings, when the mist settles into the hollows, the locals say the mountain still feels a little heavier than it used to.